Welcome to the Clinical Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Here in our PCRF Journal Club, we promote evidence-based practices by critically evaluating the latest science in emergency medical services. We hope our discussion will help advance EMS practice. Through the generous support of our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, we are able to make science more accessible and understandable.
All right, welcome everyone to the April 2026 edition of the Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum Journal Club. Special thank you again to our sponsors, Limmer Education and ESO, for making it possible for us to be here together today. I'm Remley Crow, and today I am joined by Dr. Tony Fernandez, Jeff Rollman, Dave Page, and perhaps Dr. Bill Toon. All right, and so this, as always, this discussion is going to be paired with an article that is written by our very own columnist, Michael Caduce. It'll be in EMS World. The article is called Journal Watch. I encourage all of you who listen to check this article out. It's at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. And for those of you who are tuning in live, I want to thank you and remind you that you can use that chat feature on your screen at any time to add questions and comments, and we can bring those into the discussion as we go. As a reminder, the name of the article that we are reviewing today is Impact of an eCPR Pilot Program on Outcomes After Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest for Patients Who Do Not Receive eCPR in a Large Urban EMS System. And this is hot off the press in pre-hospital emergency care. All right, so when we dive in here, I want to start with a question. I think this is foundational to what's going on in this paper is, what happens if we build the system for the 1% and then we accidentally change care for the other 99? Today's paper is about eCPR, extracorporeal CPR, probably heard about it, ECMO, big machines, big hype, but here's the twist. This study is not actually about ECMO. It's about everybody else. And what makes it so interesting and so important for EMS, honestly, we talk a lot about this in improvement science. We talk about something called a balancing measure, and that's exactly what is happening here. When we're implementing a new intervention, we need to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences for those who are not receiving the intervention, so that change in the system didn't negatively impact anything else. And so if we zoom out and take into the landscape of the greater out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, survival, we know, has been pretty low for a long time. You can look at a CARES data set anytime across the last 10 years and not a huge change in neurologically intact survival. It's still one of the hardest things to study in EMS, and I'm sure Tony and Jeff and Dave and I will talk more about the biases that are associated with cardiac arrest research and why it's so challenging to answer some of these questions. But one promising intervention that is out there is eCPR or ECMO. And so it's natural to get really excited and see a lot of folks trying to implement or figure out, do we want to have this in our system and how will we react? But the reality is that a really small proportion of patients would ever be eligible for ECMO. And we can talk about criteria in general and then specifically about the criteria in this paper. But from other papers, it's about less than 5% of patients would ever be eligible for this intervention of an already small population that's in out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. It does involve serious resources and serious logistics. So not all communities have an ECMO center available to them. And it certainly changes the way that we do things in the field. So if we are taking a patient who's potentially eligible for ECMO, this has to happen really quickly. The ECMO window is still pretty short, around 30 minutes in most systems. And so we need to make that transport or not transport decision very early. Whereas we've spent decades of research learning that staying on scene and resuscitating is better for the patients as well as the clinicians. So this is a major shift in how we would operate. And there's concern for potentially reversing some of those positive things that we've had in the last years by focusing on this new intervention. And then the other piece of this that's interesting and challenging is the definition of who's eligible in the concept of refractory VFib. So the thought is here, if patients remain in VFib and we've shocked and we're not getting that patient into another rhythm, it's time to take them to an ECMO center where this intervention could potentially help. However, there's interesting literature, interesting jury out on what is refractory, and are we really seeing refractory and that the rhythm never changed, or are we just seeing recurring VFib, meaning that the patient came out of VFib and went back into it, and maybe that's not the right cohort for this kind of intervention. But in any case, all of this raises the critical question of, well, if we're changing practice for a small group within a small group, did we accidentally make things worse for everyone else? That's what a balancing measure is. That's exactly what this study set out to answer. And there are two schools of thought on this. And I initially thought there was only one, and I'll tell you which camp I belong to. And so, school one is that concern around, well, if we have to go to an ECMO center, everybody's going to get scoop and run now, and we're going to up our intra-arrest transport. We're going to decrease ROSC for the rest of those patients and decrease their odds of survival. The other school of thought, the one I hadn't thought of, is that ECMO requires some pretty intensive training, and that training happens at all levels along the EMS agencies who are participating. And there's the notion that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so that by focusing heavy on that CPR training, even though most patients still won't be eligible for ECMO, there's a potential that we actually improve outcomes because our clinicians are so focused on CPR training in general and doing the right things for our patients. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tony here to talk a little bit about where the study took place and what they did.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Remley, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So let's dive in and let's talk specifically. Let's start with their objective, right? And I'm going to read their objective verbatim from their paper. The objective of this analysis is to use established registries which capture data elements regarding pre-hospital and hospital care for all cardiac arrest patients treated at LA County to determine the association between treatment by a pilot ALS unit post eCPR implementation and outcomes in patients with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest who did not receive eCPR, accounting for patient and agency level factors as well as temporal trends. That was a long one, right? But Remley did just describe it accurately. What we're trying to do here is see, what happened to the patients who were treated, and in some cases not treated, by folks who, providers who had this training, but these patients didn't qualify or didn't necessarily receive eCPR. And again, this is eCPR, right? This is a very small number of patients who are actually eligible for this, and we'll talk about some of the requirements as we go through this. But when a county rolls out a program, as Remley alluded to, it changes how paramedics are trained and how they think about every cardiac arrest. Not all this training, right, is not simply focused on the rare patients, although that's the emphasis of the training. It really does re-emphasize the importance of cardiac arrest care in general. So what happens with this training, right? Does it degrade care for everyone else? Or, as Remley said, does the rising tide lift all boats? And this is something that's really interesting because this kind of population level analysis, this question specifically hasn't been answered in studies before. So we talked about the two kind of possibilities here, right? Where the ePCR training, they put their paramedics through this rigorous training, protocol adherence, and they re-emphasize the protocols on high quality resuscitation. The training investment might spill over to help management of all cardiac arrests, not just ePCR. But there's the other side, right? If we're emphasizing training on 2 shocks and go, this may change how LA County normally approaches cardiac arrest. Although, their standing protocol, right, was to stay and play. So they were working these patients on scene. The eCPR protocol, that's essentially the opposite, right? If the patient has responded to 2 shocks, you load and go, and you try and take them to an eCPR capable hospital. And we talked about the difference in the two concerns. We do understand from previous research, if you've watched our podcast before, we know that research shows that transporting patients while trying to do CPR is not a good thing, right? It's definitely associated with worse outcomes. It's really hard to do good CPR in a moving ambulance. And similarly, if you move patients too soon after you get ROSC, and before they're stable, this can increase the chances of rearrest and worse outcomes. So there are some hypothetical harms that are grounded in the existing literature. So there's these two plausible mechanisms, right? Then they're going in opposite directions. And this is really the exact kind of genuine uncertainty that can drive a well-designed study that can help resolve and answer these questions. So this was a retrospective observational study, right? So the researchers, they were looking back at the data that had already been collected, right? They had IRB approval. It was a waiver of consent, and that makes sense, right? Because it would be really difficult to provide informed consent to patients who are not only unresponsive, they're in arrest, and there's a lot of them, right? 30,000+ patients. So it would be impractical. So a waiver is definitely appropriate here. And let's talk a little bit about where they did this, right? So everyone's heard of LA County EMS. It's one of the largest and most complex EMS systems in the country, about 4,000 square miles, roughly 10 million people, about 7,000 non-traumatic cardiac arrests per year. So, and EMS there is provided by, according to the paper, 29 municipal fire departments and 1 law enforcement agency. So one of the key features to this study was how they rolled out this eCPR pilot. So there were only 6 of the 29 participating agencies who participated in the pilot study. They didn't all start at the same time, so the rollout was staggered between 2018 and 2023. And this is figure 1 that's up on the screen now. And this kind of shows visually how folks came on to the pilot study. So each bar represents a group or the units. The gray is the pre-training period, and the blue is after they already went live. So this kind of staggered rollout or partial rollout creates what we like to call a natural experiment, right? And we'll talk a little bit about natural experiment. We're not going to dive too deep into this, but as we've talked about many times, right? Ideally, in research, you'd want to randomly assign or do some randomization, right? Where you randomly assign agencies into the intervention group and the group that does not get the intervention, right? And this is a way to compare both groups and kind of wash out any of the differences because of the randomization. And this way you can be relatively certain that the outcomes that you see can be attributed to the interventions alone. This isn't always possible, right? In real EMS systems, we can't actually do that. We're going to need agencies to volunteer. There are funding limitations. The logistics are just really complex to randomize everything in EMS. But when something like this happens, when the program rolls out partially and particularly at different times across a large system like this, you get something that kind of resembles randomization, right? So you get some units that are trained, some are not, and you have the before time period and after time period within the same unit, so or the same agencies, right? So you kind of wash out some of the background noise, so to speak, that you get if this was just a traditional before and after study. Some important details that I want to reemphasize about LA County and how they treated cardiac arrest, what their protocols were. So the LA County treatment protocols, they remained largely unchanged throughout the entire study period. There was one exception, and this is a relatively important one, where they switched in July of 2022 from the King to the iGel, right? And there is emerging research there about the impact of that switch on cardiac arrest survival and the like. So that is certainly something that's important to consider as you contextualize some of the results that we'll talk about soon. But there weren't any other major protocol changes during the study period that would alter the explanation of the outcomes, right? Or any other huge confounders. So the fact that the underlying research protocol was otherwise stable, right? We can have some kind of sense of comfort that the outcome changes are probably plausibly attributed to the eCPR program itself rather than something that's unmeasured. So how did they go about implementing this pilot program? Well, so we talked about this being a multi-agency pilot. This was launched in July of 2020. There was one small hospital. There was a smaller program that was being run out of one hospital since 2018. But so this is why we have the time period from 2018 to 2023. You can see the eligibility for the patients to be routed to the eCPR center. They required, so it had to be a shockable rhythm that wasn't responding to shock. So they gave them 2 shocks. They had to be within 30 minutes of a designated eCPR capable hospital. If they were outside of that 30 minutes, they were not eligible. And they had to meet age and other clinical criteria that were documented in this paper, and that were documented in prior studies. So a few things that the paramedics were required to do differently, right? So one, they had to recognize when a patient met the criteria. They had to start transport to the eCPR hospital right after that second shock if they didn't obtain ROSC. And if that happened, they used a mechanical CPR device before beginning transport. Again, we talked about how difficult it is to do manual CPR in a moving vehicle. So when we talk about the training that these patients had, obviously this is separate from what they typically do. We talked about how LA County was typically a stay and play system, which research does support. In this scenario, when a patient was eligible, the training involved hands-on scenario-based training, right? So they were held in the first 2 months before their go live for the pilot study. So this training, it covered things like who qualifies, how do you identify them quickly, how to minimize the on-scene time, right? Because again, this is different from their typical stay and play, and how to communicate with the receiving hospital. And they had hands-on practice, right? So this was not, in most cases, this was not just watching a video on how to deploy the mechanical CPR device. They had some hands-on practice. And there was a quarterly refresher throughout the pilot. There was one outlier. They call it Agency D in the paper. And one of the 6 participation agencies, they went completely with instructional videos instead of doing hands-on training. So they didn't actually have their medics apply the mechanical CPR device. This was done by a supervisor vehicle, so the supervisor would be called to scene if the patient qualified, and there was no hands-on training for this one agency. And to the author's credit, they did recognize that this could be a potential confounder. And at the beginning of the study, they recognized this was fundamentally different than the other 5. So they built into their analysis plan the option to look at their results with and without this agency. And this will be really important as we go through and we start to analyze some of these results and talk more in depth about their results. So let's talk about some of the groups, right? So there were 3 patient groups. And this is kind of the heart of the methods. This is where really the meat of what we want to understand here. So this, if you think about, the first group was the non-pilot units, right? The non-pilot ambulances. So paramedics for these agencies, they never joined the eCPR pilot. They didn't participate. The agencies were not participating either because they were too far from an eCPR capable hospital to be part of the protocol. And the patients, they were never treated by anyone who received this training. So this group doesn't tell us really anything about the eCPR program, but what it does is it gives us kind of a baseline so we can understand if CPR care in LA County changed somehow over the study period. And this is really important because remember, the study period went through the COVID years, right? So, or when COVID was really, really impacting care and the patient population. So they were able to have a baseline to compare to, separate from what the eCPR actually contributed to these patient outcomes. So in research terms, right, this is kind of a secular trend. This is the background noise that needs to be separated from the signal, right, or the intervention. So then we had our pilot units, but there were a group, as we talked about in that first figure, the pilot units who would eventually be trained in eCPR, but at the time when they took care of that particular patient, the training hadn't happened yet. So this was a good baseline comparison group for the eCPR program. So what outcomes looked like for these units before the program started. So they use the same units before and after, and this is a great way to control for things that are stable within the unit, right? Geography, patient demographics, the agency culture and practice standards, all that typically in a randomized controlled trial would likely get controlled for in randomization, but we're able to do that because of the before and after nature of when the training took place. And then the third group, right, these are the pilot units. So they were after training, right? So the patient, but again, we're talking specifically about the patients that did not receive eCPR, even though the providers went through this training after go live, right? So as we talked about, the vast majority, it was something like 98%. They just weren't eligible for eCPR. They didn't have shockable rhythms, or they were too far, or for some other patient clinical reason, they were not eligible. So this group is essentially cardiac arrest patients, your typical cardiac arrest patients managed by paramedics who've been through the training, right? And they have the mechanical CPR devices on their trucks, and they're the ones placing them. So the core analysis was group 2 versus group 3, right? Same units before and after training. Group 1's that accounts for, again, the fact that cardiac arrest survival, it was a crazy time period, right, around the COVID pandemic years. So the patient population changed, cardiac arrest changed, how we cared for patient changed, so they were able to account for that as well. And they also, what I really thought was a really important part of this study was they included field terminations, and a lot of studies will exclude these folks when resuscitation was stopped in the field, but this could artificially make your survival rates look better. So by including these patients, they give a more accurate kind of real world picture of what this case mix looks like and what the paramedics were managing every single day. So now let's move into the outcomes, right? So what did they want to find? And the primary outcome of the study was survival to hospital discharge, right? So did the patient leave the hospital alive? Hard, unambiguous, easy to interpret results, right? This is what these are our saves, right? Secondarily, they looked at neurological status to discharge, and we've read a lot of these studies where they look at their CPC scores, right? Their clinical performance category scores. So a CPC score of 1 or 2, that means good neurological function. CPC scores of 3 to 5, that's severe disability, vegetative state, and in a lot of cases, death. And they took this information. This was abstracted from the charts. This was a registered nurses. This was their in-hospital registries that we talked about earlier. So again, I love it when we could link pre-hospital data to hospital records, right? And we're getting more and more research that's able to do this and do this in a way that's meaningful and can impact care. Not everyone can do this, but because LA County had the data infrastructure to make this possible, we're really able to dive in and see true impacts of this study and this new pilot program. So the little bit about how they link data, right? So this is they took their electronic patient care records from each agency. And then they used the LA County Trauma and Emergency Medicine Information System to get the in-hospital data. They used the LA County STEMI Receiving Center database for hospitals that served. So they have STEMI receiving centers, and they have cardiac arrest receiving centers, and they have STEMI and cardiac arrest receiving centers. But the data that were submitted to these, they were able to link these through a unique identifier. And that's the easiest, cleanest way to do this, right? They didn't have to use any probabilistic or deterministic matching. They had an identifier that was on one record and tied to another record, and they were able to link the records and see what these outcomes were. So this kind of linkage it's really, it can be difficult to build and particularly to maintain, right? And to make sure that you have the same numbers on both charts throughout. A lot of systems strive for this. LA County is able to do it and do it well to support studies like this, and kudos to them. Another real interesting part of this study, and they talk about it briefly, but I think it's worth diving into a little bit. So we talk about initial heart rhythms, right? Shockable versus non-shockable, right? But in all studies, right, you're going to have some missing data, right? And one of the things that they had a few charts, right, where they didn't have documentation of if the rhythm was shockable or not, but they were able to make some really important decisions to understand kind of where these patients were supposed to fit. So LA County's cardiac arrest protocol, they have some specific requirements for when these interventions are delivered to the patient depending on the rhythm. Right. So for the shockable rhythms, it's 2 shocks and then epi. Right. For non-shockable rhythms, the epi comes first before any shocks. Right. So even if they didn't have in the data set shocks, no shock, they were able to use this to identify kind of what the rhythm was. So if there was no rhythm documented and they were never defibrillated, they classified these folks as non-shockable. Right? If there was no rhythm documented, but they defibrillated before epi, right? Those are our shockable patients. And then no rhythm was documented, but they defibrillated after epi, that was our non-shockable. And that's a great way to kind of use background information, and use what we know about the system to fill in data that weren't otherwise there. And that was, I think, a really, really smart move by the research team to not just give up on these records and throw them out, but to acknowledge the limitations, but you make smart decisions on how to utilize the data anyway. So we won't go too deep on their statistical analysis, but they did some sophisticated generalized linear mixed models, and that's a really fancy way to say kind of a high level logistic regression where you can account for a couple things, right? So not just patient level factors like we typically see in normal logistic regression, things like heart rate, bystander CPR, patient age, and the like. But you can also account for things like clustering, right? This is our random effect. So and again, we're talking a little bit about statistics. Nobody fall asleep on me. But when we talk about our random effects, right, we're talking about these patients, they're treated by the same unit on the same shift. They're not truly independent, right? They share crews, they share training backgrounds, they share geographic area. So ignoring these patients can artificially give you more confidence in your outcome than you actually should have. So they were able to account for this as well. And they were also able to account for some of the weirdness that happened during the pandemic years. So we know, again, we talked about the difference in patient population and how cardiac arrest was cared for during that time. So they used the appropriate statistical methods to account for all of these factors, rather than just a simple logistic regression model. They also ran some sensitivity analyses, and this was really a way to just put some more color around their results and to understand how much confidence you can have in these results. So, and they wanted to see if their results held up, right, across some slightly different approaches to analyze the data, so you can give you more confidence in if the results you saw are real, or if they're somehow an artifact or a function of the analysis plan. So they ran 4 sensitivity analysis, and one of them they had planned already, right? So we talked about that agency D who had the different kinds of training, that wasn't really hands-on training. So they ran the analysis with these folks and without these folks to see if the results changed. They also ran the results a couple different ways. So they ran one model where they added more covariates, right? So where the arrest happened, the presumed cause, whether an AED was used or not, to see if these additional confounders changed the conclusion. And then they used only folks with where the rhythm was documented. So we talked previously about how they imputed some of those data that were missing based on the previous knowledge that they had of how they care for patients in cardiac arrest. So they took those out, right? So they just did kind of a complete case analysis to see whether that changed their results as well. And I won't ruin the results here, but I will say that those will be really important as we get into the results to understand how confident we can be in those results. So just kind of a wrap up of the methods, and I know everyone wants to hear about the results, but just to summarize, you don't always need randomization to answer some really important questions. But what you do need is to think really carefully about your comparison groups. You got to think really carefully about the data that you have access to and what alternate explanations there are for what you find. And the authors did a really good job of this. The studies, they use a natural experiment in a real world rollout that was partial, staggered, with some clear before and after periods. And they used a really rigorous analysis to get this information analyzed and in a way that was easily interpretable. Their methods were clear. Their analysis was appropriate. And this paper, the methods for anyone who wants to do a similar evaluation, these methods should be the blueprint, right? They did a really good job of making sure how this was documented, and you can replicate this as any good study should be replicated to see if your results match what they found doing something very similar. So thank you for listening to that long windup of the methods here. And I'm really excited to move on and talk about these results.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez, for your really thorough explanation of these methods. At first thought, this paper seemed like, wait, this is way too complicated, putting in actual equations and mathematical models in the text of the paper, but you were able to break it down and show that this is really just collecting real-world EMS data and evaluating using some of those fancy tests to try to make sure that we're understanding how to interpret these results. So what is really cool about Los Angeles County, of course, being the largest county, many of our cardiac arrest studies are fairly small, only in the hundreds, maybe thousands. This study actually had just under 31,000 patients that were initially included. And they did exclude that small group of 63 that already received eCPR. So our actual study group was 30,855 adults that were in non-traumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrests treated by EMS provider agencies in Los Angeles County between 2019 and 2023. And then just looking at this big group, if we can move to our next table, sorry, table 1 after that figure. And overall, 7% of the total population had a shockable rhythm. 32% of these cardiac arrests were witnessed by a bystander. 18% of the total received bystanders CPR. And then breaking them down into these different groups of the training protocols, we saw that 32% of these adult out-of-hospital cardiac arrests were treated by the pilot units, so those who were in the study, but before they actually implemented this protocol. So prior to their training and having the mechanical circulatory devices placed on their apparatus. And then 24% were by those same units after this study was implemented, so after they completed their training. And then finally, 44% were treated by EMS providers that did not participate in this pilot at all, so weren't part of the training or weren't really in that group at all. And then table 1 just shows us our raw numbers. So these aren't adjusted, these are just sort of a kind of snapshot view of what exactly we are seeing in this population and how they might differ. And on the right side, you can see those p-values, almost all of them are highly significant. And a lot of this is because these, we just have such a large sample size that there's a lot of statistical significance, but in terms of actual clinical significance and significance that might matter to EMS providers, not as much. But there were some things, particularly later down the line, when we're looking at these actual outcomes. So we saw that overall, 16% achieved sustained ROS, so return of spontaneous circulation, 8% survived to discharge from the hospital, and 5% of them had good neurological outcome as compared to these pilot units before implementation. It was 9%, 7%, and 4%. So a bit lower for each of them on especially with the ROS, but that actual outcome that we really matter, that survival to hospital discharge with good neuro outcome, 5% after as compared to 4% before implementation. And then very similar numbers, about 4% of that survival neurologically intact for those that did not participate in the study. But remember, these are unadjusted numbers, so this doesn't account for potential differences in these population demographics that can really sway some of these outcomes, like potentially whether the cardiac arrest was witnessed by bystanders, whether bystanders actually performed CPR. And then we know the shockable rhythms, those tend to have the best outcomes. So table 2 is really showing us what we are very much interested in, because this adjusts for all these variables, all these different demographics that were just summarized in table 1. So if we move to our next table in table 2, this is our logistic regression. So this is showing our fully adjusted models. So that primary analysis, that first analysis at the top of that table is showing that treatment by the pilot units after they implemented this protocol, after the training, was not associated with worse survival. So we do see that odds ratio of 1.14, so 14% increased odds of survival, but it does cross that threshold of 1. It's very close, 0.99, but it is not statistically significant according to our pre-specified outcomes here. And some of the other things we could see under that, like shockable rhythm, we know that shockable rhythm patients tend to have much better survival, so not necessarily surprised to see that. But we do know that a big player here, a big piece of this study was the EMS agency that participated, but sort of did things differently, that they did not have that full hands-on training that all the other agencies got. They got that sort of abbreviated training. So when they excluded that group and we just looked at those who received training and were able to implement this protocol exactly as was initially intended, now we see that it is quite significant, actually, this subgroup analysis. We have that odds ratio of 1.61, and our 95% confidence interval is 1.37 to 1.95, showing 61% increased odds of survival in this group of patients treated by those who were fully trained and fully implementing those protocols as compared to patients treated by EMS agencies that were not participating in this study at all. So we see that this is quite significant, more than 50% increase odds of survival. I mean, many agencies, I mean, I'd say take that any day. That's a huge outcome, and that's seeing that that's pretty stable, even when we're looking at our 95% confidence interval. It's solidly on the side greater than 1. And similar to the full study, we see that shockable rhythm has about 6. It's a odds ratio of greater than 6. So almost 5 times or more than 5 times the survival as compared to those that were not in shockable rhythm. So the study definitely has some things that I want to highlight. Just looking at all these tables, there's a lot of data in there, a lot of numbers in there. But what Dr. Crow and Dr. Fernandez were talking about initially, how we're focusing on this really tiny subgroup of patients that are potential eCPR candidates. We were concerned about that other 99%, that maybe their care is not going to be as good. Maybe their outcomes are going to suffer. And we see here that there is no evidence of harm, that we see actually the opposite, that there seems to be some potential benefits when it comes to survival, even in this population that is not getting any of this ECMO CPR, but just getting this whole bundle of care with a renewed emphasis on training and making sure that we're prioritizing some of those things during cardiac arrest management that we know are really key to survival. We did see those raw outcome differences, which were pretty interesting in Table 1, but we know that that adjusted analysis really matters a lot because these populations aren't all identical. We know we wanted to adjust since that post-implementation group did have more witness arrests and more bystander CPR, more shockable rhythms. We know there are other things going on in the background of this study that may have contributed to more folks being potentially willing to start CPR, maybe being able to even recognize that somebody is in cardiac arrest. So that's where I want our take home to be from that Table 2, and not just the crude percentages that we see. And then finally, looking at Table 2, again, we can see that that effect is way greater magnitude when we're looking at this exclusion of that agency. So that shows that the quality of this intervention, the quality of how this is implemented, the quality of the training really could be that secret sauce in a sense that is providing this really amazing survival benefit. So yes, they did have that same protocol on paper, but by not getting that hands-on training that all the other EMS agencies that participated in the study got, we could see that maybe that really wasn't able to provide those outcomes. So yes, this is talking about patients. We're talking about patient outcomes, but I'd say this paper is something that is really more of a systems effect paper where we're looking at protocols and we're thinking about individual patient management. But this paper is focused on what's happening to that entire system, that huge system in LA County, where again, most studies never have this many patients in them. So we can really draw conclusions and show that really following this careful study protocol and making sure that it's being fully implemented, full training in person, and all the steps are fully implemented can really provide some potentially promising patient outcomes. the end of the day. So very promising to see this study results.
Absolutely. And I think that was a great summary of the results, and thank you. And I'll echo the kudos from both of my co-panelists. This was not an easy study to take on, and the authors did a fantastic job at considering the other things that could influence their results. Primarily, the thing I came in with was, well, data change over that time period and our approach to resuscitation, and even things like bystander CPR awareness. We had some public cases that may have driven up rates of bystander CPR. And so all of those but what ifs start circulating in our heads, and we see that those were included in the models and accounted for in the various subgroup analyses. And so this gives a strong signal towards no harm when we're talking about implementing. But I don't want to pretend that happened on accident. This was very deliberate, and they set up the system to get those results that they got. Just rolling out transport to an ECMO center could have a bad effect if those guardrails and that training and all of those other things had not been in place to make the system successful. And a couple of other things in here that show that I think there was a lot of systems planning going on is that it appears, if we look in table 1, that the units who were trained to go to the eCPR centers were being matched with the right patient groups. And so in some of the agencies, or at least one of the agencies, not every unit had been trained. And so matching that dispatch, even thinking as far back as the first point of medical contact, matching that dispatch and making sure that unit goes or gets to the scene is a key component. And so, I look at the initial rhythm part of the table and I see, okay, it's at 7% overall, but then when we look at the treated by a trained unit, that number goes up to 12%, showing that perhaps there's some considerations in how we're assigning and prioritizing which units go to which scenes can have a huge impact, especially when a resource is limited. The other thing that I want to keep an eye on in here is those TOR patients. So when we look at pre-hospital TOR, there was no statistical difference there and no potential signal. The overall rate was 68%. And then looking at the unit where I would be concerned is the trained unit, the unit that's ready to go to an eCPR center. The lowest that went was 64. But for systems who are looking to replicate or maybe implementing similar protocols, this would be an area where I would put some focus and continue to monitor that balancing measure. We know that there's the Hawthorne effect and there's a tendency for things to shift and drift over time. And so it's important to keep in mind and keep a pulse check on those vital signs of your system. My last takeaway before I turn it back to my co-panelists for their final thoughts as we wrap up is the type of training likely matters here. And I thought it was very interesting. They had a natural experiment within a natural experiment of one organization or one of the provider agencies doing video-based training primarily without that scenario-based education. I think we see a signal here. Of course, the study wasn't set up or tried to ask and answer that question in this particular paper, but it's something for us to consider. And as field clinicians, knowing that watching somebody put on a mechanical compression device is a lot different than mastering that choreography yourself. It's something that does require a lot of muscle memory and a lot of skill to do. So something that I'd love to know from the system is how often is this training recurring? Still remains, even though 7,000 cardiac arrests is huge, it's still at an individual level remains a high criticality, low frequency event. And so how do we ensure that muscle memory stays after we've implemented something like this, and thinking through what's the right cadence to retrain and continue to train on this. And with that, I'll pause and I'll ask my co-panelists for their final thoughts on this paper before I have the unenviable task of wrapping us up. So Dr. Fernandez, Jeff, any final takeaways for our audience that you got from this paper?
I think my biggest takeaway is hard things, right? Hard questions can be answered, and the analysis, it just takes a little kind of planning, and particularly if you can work with your systems and you have the setup that LA County does, you can answer some really hard questions, and you don't have to have the perfect randomized double-blinded controlled trial. This was a high level study that did some really good analyses and sophisticated statistics, and they were able to answer questions in a way that we hadn't been done before. So I think that again, kudos to the authors. I think take these analyses, and for folks who are thinking about a eCPR program, this is certainly something that you'd want to put in your decisions scheme. But overall, really cool study. I'm happy we got to talk about it, and thanks everyone for joining us today.
Well said. And Jeff?
Definitely echo all of your thoughts that this was a very carefully done study where they wrote up those results and explained things to us very clearly. But this is something that, yes, we consider research, and I know this was definitely approved as a research paper, but I would say this is something that we can think about eCPR and implementing a eCPR program as actually a quality improvement strategy. That LA County, of course, has a ton of patients there that we know there's going to be at least some who are going to get eCPR, but even smaller agencies where they may wonder, hey, I'm only going to get a few patients that might actually fit into this protocol. Why should I even bother? This paper demonstrates that really this whole program around eCPR and the training and system changes can really be a quality improvement strategy to improve our overall cardiac arrest outcomes. We know that it's a lot of pieces. We have equipment changes potentially. We have protocol changes for how long we're staying on scene or not. We have training around our actual physical tasks that we need to do during cardiac arrest management, how to loop in our hospital, the medical direction, and really decisions on how to make on how to handle these patients. This is all something that can be thought of in a quality improvement lens. So I think this paper really answered a lot of questions, but also brings up a lot of questions too, since a lot was going on at the same time, and we're not exactly sure, was it that hands-only training? Was it how the mechanical compression devices were deployed? Was it the scene management? Was it the amount of time on scene? There were a lot of different things going on, and it's not clear which of them had the biggest effect, which maybe didn't have any effect. So I'd say, like most studies, we always, yes, this answers questions, but we have even more questions, and we know there's more need for future research in this area. But I think it's an excellent study, and looking forward to seeing what's coming out next from this group.
I couldn't agree more. And I love what Tony said early on, not letting perfection be the enemy of good. I thought these authors were very creative about how to deal with missing data in an appropriately conservative way. So what do we do when we don't have the perfect data set? Do we just not do the study then? No, of course not. These authors found ways to make that happen. And I want to, again, give them huge kudos for not only looking at the shiny new thing. I think it's really important we look at shiny new things. However, focusing on what else changes in the system if we introduce something new. Huge across the board, not just for cardiac arrest. That's something that I love when EMS systems are thinking about, not just the process and the outcome measures, but also taking those balancing measures into account. And as far as the final punchline or the headline on this study, I am very happy to be wrong in this case, and that the implementation of such a program did not just result in everybody scooping and running to the nearest eCPR center. And that's no accident. There was a lot of really important training that took place, and I hope that we have an opportunity to learn more about that training so that others can replicate, because this truly is a systems result, and these authors and these systems put a ton of time and effort into this that I hope others can benefit from. And now, as we wrap up, I want to thank those of you who were here live with us and those who are listening later on. I'll also take this opportunity to remind you that we are going to have the education version of this research podcast on Friday, April 24th at noon Central. And we'll be right back here next month with the clinical version of the Journal Club podcast on Monday, May 11th at noon Central. And we look forward to spending time with you on the next one. Have a great time, everyone.
We hope you have enjoyed and learned from this PCRF Journal Club. Please share it with other interested EMS professionals. An archive of past journal clubs can be found at pcrfpodcasts.org. You can also find us on Facebook at PCRF at UCLA and on our website, prehospitalcare.org. A special thank you to our sponsors, Limmer Education, providing educational tools for success at every stage of your EMS journey, and ESO, dedicated to improving community health and safety through the power of data.